I found out HOA Karen Tor. Down the bridge on my farm, I'm not even in their HOA. That's a sentence I never thought I'd say out loud, until the morning I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and noticed something was terribly wrong. My wooden footbridge, the one I built myself years ago so I could cross the creek and reach the back pasture, was gone. Not collapsed by weather, not worn down by time, but chainsawed into splinters and dumped in the water like someone had executed it. And there she stood, HOA Karen, arms crossed, sunglasses shining like mirrored judgment, wearing that self-satisfied smirk that always meant she thought she'd fixed something. Behind her, the work crew she hired scrambled into their trucks the moment they saw me charging toward them. They didn't even try to explain. They just sped off as if they knew exactly how illegal this was. The wildest part, I'm not in their HOA. I've never signed a single HOA document. My 50-acre farm isn't even within their neighborhood boundaries. But that didn't stop Karen from acting like anything her eyes could land on belonged under her control. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. I grew up on this farm. My great-grandfather bought these 50 acres, back when the nearest paved road was 10 miles away, and the idea of homeowners associations sounded like something from a bad joke. The land had history baked into it. Old fence posts he drove into the ground, the barn my grandfather rebuilt after a storm in the 60 seconds, the pasture my dad cleared with nothing but a tractor older than he was. I always thought this place would stay simple, quiet, predictable, but things changed the day the mini-mansion development went up on the neighboring hill. At first, it didn't bother me. I figured if people wanted to live in overpriced stucco boxes with identical mailboxes and matching flower beds, that was their business. I didn't mind having new neighbors. But I did mind when those neighbors brought along an HOA made up of the most entitled, self-important busybodies I'd ever met. The first complaint came less than a month after they moved in. A letter printed in gold-trimmed stationery informing me that my cows were disturbing the peace by making too much noise. Cows, making too much noise. On my farm. I laughed so hard I nearly fell off the porch. I wrote them back politely. Cows moo, that's kind of their thing, and assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few days later, I found another notice taped to my fence. This one claimed my cattle were leaving waste too close to the property line, and that it violated community cleanliness standards. Mind you, my fence had been standing there long before their houses existed. If anything, they built too close to me. I tried to be civil. When I ran into some of the neighbors while checking fences, I explained that farms aren't decorative. Animals make sounds, smells, and messes. That's life. Most of them understood. But there was one face I kept seeing: tight smile, stiff posture, that unmistakable air of superiority. Karen. The first time she marched onto my land to complain, she didn't even bother to introduce herself. She stood just a few feet past my gate, hands on her hips like she was walking into her own backyard. "Your barn is an eyesore," she said, gesturing toward a structure older than both of us combined. "The peeling paint is affecting the aesthetics of the community." I blinked at her. "This isn't your community," I replied, calm as I could manage. "And this barn isn't under your authority." Her lips pressed tight like she'd tasted something sour. "Everything visible from HOA land is under HOA concern." That line should have been my warning. It was the verbal equivalent of a storm cloud forming. After that, the letters came weekly, sometimes twice a week. The barn was too old. The tractors were too rusty. My equipment shed needed repainting. My cows wandered too close to the fence. The fencing didn't match neighborhood standards. My property lacked visual uniformity. She was trying to drag my farm into her HOA by sheer force of will, but I ignored it all. I knew my rights. I knew the boundaries. And I knew her authority ended where my fence began. Then they found the bridge. The footbridge wasn't pretty, I'll admit that. It was built from rough timber, a weekend project with my dad before he passed. It crossed the creek that ran along the border of my land and made it easier to reach the back pasture. Over the years, it had weathered sun-bleached planks, a few rusty bolts, the kind of character you can't fake. To me, it was a memory. To Karen, it was an unsightly structure posing a safety hazard and disrupting the premium ambiance of the neighborhood. Her words, not mine. I still remember the day she walked right up to the creek dressed in a bright pink blazer like she was allergic to subtlety and stared at the bridge like it offended her personally. "This will need to be removed," she said. I laughed. "This isn't a suggestion." She narrowed her eyes. "No, it's a directive. A directive from who? The HOA. I'm not in your HOA. Anything viewed from HOA property falls under HOA regulation. There it was again. That magical rule she invented. The "if we can see it, we own it" doctrine. I told her plainly, this bridge is staying. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just gave me this cold, satisfied little smile that said she wasn't done yet. Things got strange after that. A week before the destruction, I noticed people walking near the creek, strangers not from town. One had a vest with reflective strips like a contractor. Another carried a clipboard. They stood around my bridge, pointing, whispering, taking photos. The next day, a couple of HOA board members stood on their balconies with binoculars aimed toward my land, not even pretending to hide it. Then came the final letter, bold red text across the top. Final notice regarding unsafe structure. It demanded immediate removal of the bridge, citing public danger, visual disruption, and my personal favorite, non-compliance with neighborhood design cohesion. I didn't bother responding. Now, looking back, I should have known something was coming. Karen wasn't the type to back down when her ego was bruised. But even then, I never imagined she'd go as far as what she did. The night before the incident, the farm felt different, quiet in a way that wasn't natural. No trucks passing on the nearby road, no late-night dog barking from the neighbors, just stillness, the kind that settles in right before something breaks. The next morning I heard a sound I'll never forget, the deep, steady growl of chainsaws. When I rounded the corner and saw what they were doing to my bridge, I swear I felt something snap inside me. Not just anger, not just disbelief. Something deeper, like they were ripping apart a piece of my family's history. The men cutting the beams weren't local. They looked uncomfortable, glancing over their shoulders as if they knew they weren't supposed to be there. And then there was Karen, standing on the bank with her arms crossed, tapping her foot with this look of triumph, like she was finally enforcing some cosmic order she believed I had violated. When she saw me charging down the path, her expression didn't change. If anything, she smiled wider. "Good morning," she said, as if nothing unusual was happening behind her. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded. "Removing an unauthorized structure," she replied calmly. "For the safety of the community. This is my land, my bridge. You're trespassing." "It was visible from HOA property," she said, shrugging. "So it fell under our standards." I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the sheriff." She tilted her head. "Go ahead." But the moment the workers heard the words sheriff, they panicked. They shut off the saws, scooped up their tools, jumped into their trucks, and tore out of there, nearly sideswiping each other in the rush. Karen didn't chase them. She didn't call out. She just watched them leave, then turned back to me with an expression somewhere between annoyance and confidence. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. But the damage was done. My bridge, my memory, lay in pieces in the water. And at that moment, all the annoyance, frustration, and restraint I'd given her over the months hardened into one very clear decision: Karen had crossed the line. And this time I was going to make damn sure she regretted it. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the wreckage in the creek like I was looking at a body. The water pushed through broken boards, swirling around splinters and twisted bolts. It wouldn't stop rushing, even though everything else around me suddenly felt frozen silent except for the churn of anger building in my chest. Karen didn't move. She just shifted her weight like she was waiting for me to finish whatever emotional moment she assumed I'd have so she could deliver another HOA lecture. But even she must have sensed something in the way I looked at her, because she finally stepped back a few feet. "You're being unreasonable," she said, brushing imaginary dust off her sleeve. "You knew this structure violated community standards. There is no community here except the one in your head," I said, voice low. "You broke the law." "You'll thank me one day," she replied, absolutely serious. That bridge was dangerous. I stared at her, trying to process the level of delusion it took to vandalize someone's property and then expect gratitude for it. My hands were shaking, not out of fear, but the kind of controlled fury that makes you speak slower, calmer, more precise. "Get off my land," I said. Her expression twitched just slightly. The smile slipped, replaced by something cold and challenging. "This isn't over," she said. She walked away with that stiff chin-up posture of someone who thought they were still in control. But as I watched her walk up the hill toward her picture-perfect neighborhood, I already knew one thing: it was over, just not in the way she thought. I turned back to the creek, breathing hard. Every board, every nail, every knot of wood that had made up that little bridge was a memory. Dad and I hammered the planks together on a fall afternoon with a thermos of coffee and a radio playing old country music. Mom brought down sandwiches that we ate sitting on the half-finished rails. When I was younger, I sat on that bridge with my feet in the water on hot summer days, letting the cold current wash over my ankles. And now it lay shattered, because some bored suburban tyrant thought she had the right to beautify land she didn't own. I pulled my phone from my pocket, hands still trembling, and started taking photos from every angle. Footprints in the mud, fresh sawdust, clean-cut beam ends, the creek clogged with debris. I documented it, all the kind of documentation I knew would matter. I took a video narrating the entire scene, pointing out where the crew had stood, where Karen had been standing, which direction they fled. I wasn't about to face this empty-handed. By the time I finished, the sun was higher, the air warmer, but inside me, everything was cold, steady, focused. I walked back to the farmhouse, uploaded the photos, backed up the videos twice, and then made 2 calls. First, the sheriff's office. Second, my lawyer. I'd hired him years ago to deal with a boundary dispute after a neighbor tried to plant a fence too far onto my land. He was sharp, calm, and absolutely ruthless when it came to property law, the exact kind of person I needed now. He answered on the second ring. "Morning," he said. "What's going on? I've got a situation," I replied. "OA, Karen had a crew trespass and tear down my bridge." A pause. "Say that again," he said slowly, as if making sure he'd heard right. "Exactly what you think. They cut it apart with chainsaws. I have photos, videos, witnesses." He exhaled through his teeth. "All right. Email everything to me. I'll start drafting a demand letter today." "You said HOA, yes. But I'm not part of it." That, he said with satisfaction, is a very important detail. While he worked on the legal side, I spent the rest of the morning walking the property, calming the cattle, checking fences, anything to burn off the anger slowly boiling under my skin. But even as I walked, things started falling into place in my mind. Karen wasn't acting alone. HOA boards don't just assume jurisdiction over non-member land unless someone stokes the fire. And the way she stood there supervising the demolition, that wasn't a last-minute stunt. It was planned, approved, coordinated. They'd crossed a line, and now I intended to drag them across a courtroom floor. Around noon, I heard gravel crunching on the front drive. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up, dust swirling behind it. Deputy Morris stepped out, a big guy with a calm manner, the kind who could calm a bar fight without raising his voice. "Morning," he said. "We got your call." I took him down to the creek. He whistled low under his breath when he saw the wreckage. "Looks deliberate," he said. "Oh, it was," I replied. "HOA hired a crew," Karen supervised. "You got proof of that?" I nodded, and played the video. The muddy tire tracks, the sound of chainsaws, Karen's voice saying the bridge needed to be removed. Morris folded his arms. "And you're not part of their association, not even close." He shook his head. "Then they don't have a leg to stand on." "This is criminal damage. We'll file a report." For the first time that morning, the tightness in my chest loosened a little. After Morris left, I grabbed lunch, though I barely tasted it. I couldn't stop thinking about something he'd said. They don't have a leg to stand on. Good, because I was about to kick out the other one. Late afternoon, I drove into town to pick up a few supplies, and that's when the rumors started swirling. At the feed store, old man Dalton raised an eyebrow at me. "Heard Karen's been poking her nose where it don't belong," he said. "That's one way to put it." At the hardware store, one of the clerks muttered, "They're saying HOA's planning to revitalize the view. Whatever that means." Ah, so that was her angle. The bridge disrupted their perfect postcard hills, and Karen, queen of aesthetic purity, couldn't allow anything rustic or real to mar her kingdom. By the time I drove back home, the anger was no longer hot. It was cold, focused, a slow-burning determination that settled deep. When I reached my gate, something caught my eye. A drone. Not high up, not subtle. Hovering boldly just above the fence line, pointing straight at my property like it was conducting surveillance. I stood there watching it for a moment. It bobbed slightly in the breeze, its camera lens adjusting like an insect eye focusing on prey. So that's how they'd been planning it. They'd been watching my land, spying on the bridge, plotting. I picked up a rock from the driveway. I didn't throw it. I wasn't about to break my own law for a momentary sense of satisfaction, but I held it up where the drone could see. The drone blinked its light twice, then zipped away like a startled bird. When I walked back inside the house, I opened my laptop to find an email from my lawyer. Subject line, "Draft ready. Review as soon as possible." The letter was firm, clear, and left absolutely no room for interpretation. HOA was responsible. Karen was liable. The crew trespassed. The damage was documented, and they owed $5,000 for replacement and cleanup. The letter demanded payment within 7 days. I leaned back in my chair, breathing slowly, letting the adrenaline settle. But deep down, I had a feeling Karen wasn't going to roll over. She'd already escalated farther than most rational people ever would. destroying property, trespassing, hiring a crew to do her bidding. She thought she had power, real absolute power. And people like that don't back down just because a letter tells them to. Karen was going to fight, and I was ready for it. I didn't have to wait long for Karen's response. She struck faster than I expected, though in hindsight I should have known someone that impulsive wouldn't sit quietly and think things through. The very next morning, before the sun had a chance to burn through the fog hanging low over my pasture, I found an envelope shoved into my front gate. No postage, no stamp. Just shoved between the metal bars like someone wanted to make sure it was seen immediately. The handwriting on the front was painfully familiar. Big loops, aggressive pressure. Karen. I took the letter inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a moment. I could already imagine the tone self-righteous, condescending, dripping with the confidence of someone who believed rules never applied to her. When I finally opened it, I wasn't disappointed. The letter began with, "We will not pay you a single cent, not even dear or to whom it may concern." Just straight into hostility, like she was writing from the middle of a tantrum. She went on to declare that the bridge was an illegal structure, that it posed a danger to the community, and my favorite line, that it disrupted the architectural harmony of the subdivision. My farm. Disrupting their harmony. I kept reading, jaw-tightening as she doubled down. Any future structures you attempt to build on your property that are visible from the HOA community will be removed without warning. That sentence alone could have been framed as evidence of criminal intent, but she wasn't done. She added a threat thinly veiled, but a threat nonetheless. "We will be conducting regular inspections to ensure compliance with community standards." Inspections on land they didn't own, on a property they had zero legal authority over. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the sheer absurdity of it all pushed me past anger into disbelief. She thought she could intimidate me. She thought she could bully me. She thought she could control me. She had no idea how badly she'd miscalculated. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer before I finished my coffee. His reply came within minutes. "This is excellent for us," he wrote. "It proves intent and overreach. They just handed us half the case." My anger finally found a productive outlet. But even as the legal machine spun into motion, the emotional toll didn't disappear overnight. I walked back to the creek that afternoon, staring at the jagged remains of what had once been a peaceful place. I knelt down, running my fingers along the split wood. The memories that had soaked into those boards seemed almost louder, now echoing in the space Karen had violated. A crow sat on a branch above, watching me with the same curiosity the neighbors had shown since the demolition. I wondered what rumors were spreading now. I wondered what stories the HOA members had heard from Karen. Probably some nonsense about me being unstable or refusing to cooperate with safety regulations. She always did have a talent for twisting reality until it suited her narrative. As I walked back up the hill, something glinted in the grass near the fence line. I bent down and picked it up, a small metal badge, the kind contractors wear on their belts. It had a company name stamped on the back. A real lead. I called them immediately. "Are you the folks who sent a crew out near Oak Crest subdivision yesterday?" I asked. Silence on the other end. "Sir, we aren't supposed to discuss client jobs." "Well, I said your crew trespassed, destroyed private property, then fled like thieves when law enforcement was mentioned. So I suggest you either tell me what you know, or I hand this badge directly to the sheriff." More silence. A long one. Then a strained voice. "We were told the HOA owned the land," the man admitted. "We didn't know. Did Karen hire you?" "Yes, she said it was urgent." I thanked him, hung up, and immediately contacted the sheriff's office again. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was coordinated fraud. Deputy Morris came back out that afternoon. "This just keeps getting better for you," he said, jotting down the contractor's statement. "She lied to them, claimed ownership. That's another charge." I watched him file the report, my mood lifting, not out of pettiness, but out of justice. Real justice. For once, someone in authority was seeing what I already knew. Karen wasn't just an annoyance. She was dangerous. That evening, the sun had barely dipped below the horizon before my phone buzzed. It was my neighbor Hank, the one with the old hound dog that barked at everything except storms. "You might want to step outside," he said. I walked out onto the porch and saw exactly what he meant. A group of HOA board members were gathered near the property line, huddled together like a flock of overdressed birds. They weren't trespassing yet, but their presence alone was enough to make my skin crawl. They kept glancing toward the house, whispering. One woman held a binder. Another had a clipboard. And one man whom I'd never met was pacing the fence line like a guard dog. but Karen wasn't there. That was interesting. After a few minutes, the group dispersed, leaving behind only the faint echo of their murmurs. But the message was clear enough. They were circling the wagons, preparing a counterattack. Sure enough, the next morning I found a second letter waiting for me. This one was typed, stamped with the HOA's official seal, and slipped into a plastic sleeve. A performance through and through. It read, "This correspondence serves as official documentation that your refusal to cooperate with community safety measures is being recorded. We are obligated to protect property values and resident welfare. Your bridge posed a clear and unacceptable danger." I almost choked. A danger. My bridge hadn't hurt a soul in a decade. The only danger was the fantasy world Karen lived in, where aesthetics mattered more than the law. Then came the best part. Failure to comply with future directives will result in legal action. Legal action from an entity that didn't have jurisdiction over me. If my lawyer had been there, he'd have framed the letter as evidence on the spot. I drove straight to his office in town. He read through the documents, nodding slowly. "Excellent," he said. "False authority, repeated harassment, written threats, unwarranted surveillance. This is becoming a full case, not just property damage." I left his office feeling something I hadn't felt since the bridge went down control. For days afterward, Karen was strangely quiet. No more letters, no more HOA scouts, no more drones buzzing around like flies. It was suspicious, but I wasn't naive enough to believe she'd backed off. People like her don't retreat. They reload. And she did 1 week later at the HOA community meeting. I wasn't invited. Of course not. I wasn't a resident. But half the town showed up anyway because everyone knew Karen had gone too far this time. I heard the whole thing from a neighbor recorded on his phone. Karen stood at the front of the room waving papers, insisting she'd acted for the good of the community. She called my bridge hazardous, illegal, and a blight on the environment. She accused me of being uncooperative, unsafe, even hostile. And then she said something that sealed her fate. She claimed the HOA had full jurisdiction over all land visible from the community. The room erupted. Someone shouted, "That's not how the law works," another yelled. "You can't control his farm." Even some of her own board members exchanged nervous glances. She'd exposed herself. Her arrogance had become her downfall. And when the recording reached my lawyer, he nearly laughed. "She just publicly admitted to overreach," he said. "This is going to be the easiest case of my career." But Karen didn't know that yet. She still thought she was winning. She still thought she could intimidate me. She still thought she had power. She had no idea what was about to hit her. The recording from that HOA meeting spread through town faster than a grass fire in a dry summer. People stopped me at the hardware store, at the gas station, even at the feed mill, asking if I'd heard what Karen said. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others cursed under their breath. A few laughed because it was so far beyond anything reasonable that you either had to laugh or lose your mind. But the truth was, I wasn't laughing. Not yet. Because I knew people like her didn't collapse cleanly. They flailed. They dragged everyone around them down in a spiral before finally burning out. And I had a sinking feeling she was about to make this situation even uglier before it got better. My lawyer, however, was practically energized. "We're filing today," he said, sliding the paperwork across his desk. "This isn't just property damage anymore. This is harassment, trespassing, intimidation, and malicious intent, all documented, public, and verifiable." He typed with a speed that would have impressed my late father, who believed computers were witchcraft. "And the best part," he continued, "she admitted out loud on record that she believes HOA authority extends beyond its boundaries. That alone could get the entire board investigated for abuse of power." Somehow hearing it stated that plainly made the tension in my chest loosen just a bit. Still, I couldn't shake the unease curling in my gut. Karen hadn't retaliated yet, not truly. And when people like her went quiet, it usually meant they were planning something bigger. I found out what that something bigger was 3 nights later. It started around 9 after dark. The cattle were restless, shifting, and snorting more than usual. My dog Ranger stood at the window growling softly, a low warning rumble he only made when something was really wrong. I walked out onto the porch with a flashlight scanning the fields. At first I saw nothing, but then near the far fence line a quick flicker of movement, a shadow ducking down. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and headed toward it. Ranger stayed at my side, ears pinned forward. As I got closer, shapes came into view, 2 figures crouched near the property stakes, muttering quietly. One held a clipboard, the other had a flashlight pointed at the ground. They weren't teenagers messing around. They weren't animals. They were grown adults in dark jackets behaving like thieves. My voice cut through the night. "You two, Planning on returning something you stole, I said, or are you here to take more? The figures jerked upright so fast the clipboard almost flew out of one guy's hand. The other shielded his eyes from my flashlight. "Yes, sir," one stammered. We're conducting an inspection," Ranger growled. "An inspection for what I asked," stepping closer. "Trespassing." "No, sir, the HOA." "Stop right there," I snapped. "This land isn't HOA territory. You know that, I know that. And your president knows it too." The man with the clipboard swallowed hard. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cold night air. "We're just following orders," he murmured. "Karen's orders, of course." "Turn around," I said, "and walk back to where you came from before I call the sheriff again." They didn't argue. They just scurried off into the darkness, stumbling over themselves as though afraid I might actually let Ranger chase them out. I stood there for a long moment after they left, staring out over my fields. The moonlight painted everything silver serene, untouched exactly how I wanted it, but in my chest unease twisted again. Karen wasn't backing down. The next morning proved that. At dawn, I found a new letter shoved under my windshield wiper. The envelope was crumpled like it had been held too tightly. I opened it carefully, expecting another rant, but this one was different. Short, sharp, threatening. "You will regret escalating this," it read. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." That was it. No signature, no stamp, no reason. Just pure arrogance dripping off the page. My lawyer laughed when he saw it. "She's panicking," he said. "This kind of behavior tells me she knows she's losing." But panic wasn't what worried me. Desperation was. Desperate people make reckless choices, and Karen was about to prove that. The next day I stopped by the local diner for lunch. The place was buzzing, not the regular lunchtime chatter, but whispers. Curious glances. A few people shifting in their booths when I walked by. I took a seat at the counter and the waitress Millie leaned close. "You hear the news," she whispered. "What news?" Karen filed. "An injunction." I nearly dropped my fork. "An injunction against me." Millie nodded. "Filed it this morning. Claims you're building dangerous structures. Says you threaten the community." And she lowered her voice. "She claims you harassed her workers." I almost laughed, but it came out more like a scoff. "She's grasping at straws," I said. "Yeah," Millie agreed. "But she's waving those straws like they're a sword." My lawyer confirmed it that afternoon. "She filed it with no evidence," he said. "Just accusations and vague statements. It won't hold up. But it does show a pattern of retaliation which strengthens your case." Karen had no idea she was making things worse for herself with every action. But the real turning point came a week later when the official court summons arrived. Not for me, for the HOA. The judge had reviewed our filings, the footage, the audio recordings, and Karen's written threats. And she issued a notice of hearing requiring the HOA to appear in court to answer for property destruction, trespassing, and harassment. It was time for the showdown. The courthouse wasn't big, just a brick building with squeaky doors and a lobby that smelled faintly of old paper and floor cleaner. But that day it felt like the center of the universe. Karen arrived dressed like she was attending a gala, bright pink blazer, pearl necklace, heels, clicking like gunshots on the tile floor. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge the small crowd of onlookers. She just marched to her seat with her head high, as if the world still bent to her will. The rest of the HOA board looked miserable. Some avoided eye contact. One man had the posture of someone heading for a firing squad. My lawyer sat beside me, flipping through his notes. Calm, confident. "You ready?" he asked. "I've been ready since the day she cut down my bridge." When the judge entered, the room quieted instantly. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and a voice that cut through the air like a knife. After the formalities, she invited my lawyer to speak first. He laid out everything: the history of the farm, the photos, the video, the contractor's statement, the letters Karen had written, every arrogant word, every threat, every fabrication. When he played the recording from the HOA meeting, the entire courtroom turned toward Karen. Her face flushed, her mouth tightened, but she didn't speak. Then it was her turn. She stood confidently, too confidently, and approached the front. "Your Honor," she began, voice sugar-coated and trembling with false sincerity, "I was acting in the best interest of my community." The judge didn't blink. "You destroyed a private structure on land not under your jurisdiction." Karen lifted her chin. It was visible. And therefore, the judge cut her off sharply. "Visibility does not equal ownership or authority, Miss Harris. Please explain why you believed you had the right to demolish something outside HOA boundaries." Karen faltered. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Words refused to form. Her confidence cracked. And in that moment, supported by a mountain of evidence and a community of witnesses, everything she'd built, her authority, her reputation, her fabricated power, began to crumble in front of everyone. The judge leaned forward. "Miss Harris, this court needs the truth. Not assumptions, not invented rules. Why did you order the destruction of your neighbor's bridge?" Karen swallowed. Then, in a shaky voice dripping with anger, she snapped, "Because it was ugly." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even my lawyer paused. The judge stared at her as though she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. And then she said the words that changed everything. "We're done here. I've heard enough." In that moment, I knew the tide had fully turned. Karen had finally defeated herself. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete you could hear the ticking of the old wall clock above the judge's bench. Karen's last sentence, "Because it was ugly," hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. You could almost see the exact moment the judge decided she no longer needed to entertain anything else this woman had to say. Karen seemed to realize it too. Her face went pale, then flushed a violent shade of red, then settled somewhere between indignation and panic. She opened her mouth again as if she wanted to explain, backpedal, or reframe her outburst, but the judge lifted a single finger. "Miss Harris," she said sharply, "that will be enough." Karen froze, mouth still slightly open. Then slowly she lowered herself back into her seat. Her hands trembled as she clasped them tightly in her lap. I noticed her nails, perfectly manicured, painted a gleaming pink digging crescents into the back of her own hand. My lawyer leaned over and whispered, "She just sunk her own ship." I nodded. I knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. The judge took a long moment to shuffle through the documents in front of her. She didn't look rushed. She didn't look irritated. She looked disappointed, like a teacher who'd caught a student cheating in the most spectacularly stupid way possible. Let the record reflect. The judge said that the homeowner association, represented by Miss Harris, has admitted to ordering the demolition of a privately owned structure on private land that does not fall under HOA authority and has failed to provide any legal justification. Furthermore, their written communications, she tapped the pile of letters my lawyer submitted, show a pattern of harassment and an assumption of jurisdiction where none exists. A murmur spread through the room. Even those who came in undecided seemed to lean back in their seats satisfied. Justice was unfolding piece by piece. Karen shifted in her chair. She tugged on her blazer sleeve, smoothing fabric that didn't need smoothing. Her leg bounced uncontrollably under the table, a nervous tic she couldn't hide anymore. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly as she shifted her attention to the HOA board members seated behind Karen. Some of them looked like they wanted to sink through the floor tiles. One man wiped sweat from his brow with a shaking hand. Before pronouncing judgment, the judge asked a final question. "Is anyone on the board prepared to justify these decisions, to confirm whether Miss Harris acted with board approval?" The silence was so profound it felt staged. Finally, one man, the one who'd been pacing my fence line a week earlier, slowly stood up. His voice wavered. "Your Honor, the board, we didn't authorize this. We were told the bridge was on HOA land." He swallowed. "We trusted her." Karen snapped her head toward him. "What are you doing?" she hissed. But it was too late. Another board member stood, then another. Each one echoed the same sentiment they believed Karen when she'd said my land somehow fell under their jurisdiction. They took her at her word. They didn't bother to check maps or boundaries because Karen always presented herself as the unquestionable authority. Then one of the women stepped forward, mid-50s, tidy hair posture, stiff with anxiety. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "we were given a map, one that showed his fence inside our boundary line." Karen said he'd moved it. My lawyer raised an eyebrow at me, then at the judge. The judge frowned. "A map, provided by Miss Harris." The woman nodded. My lawyer leaned in and whispered, "There's the twist. If Karen forged or altered a map, this case wasn't just property damage anymore, it was fraud." The judge requested the map. It was produced, a printed survey with clearly drawn lines, but the judge looked at it for only a second before sliding it back across the desk with a firm hand. "This is not accurate," she said. "The county boundary records clearly show the line has not changed in over 75 years. The room erupted again, low whispers, angry mutters, shocked gasps. Karen's shoulders rose defensively. I must have mixed up the documents," she stammered. "No," the judge replied, her voice dropping an octave tone, turning icy. "You misrepresented legal boundaries to your board to justify destroying private property. That is not a mistake. That is deception." Karen's jaw fell open. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for anyone to help her. But the board members had already shifted away from her. No one wanted to be within her blast radius. The judge took another long pause before delivering her ruling. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. The homeowner association is liable for the destruction of the bridge, the cost of debris, removal property damage, and associated legal fees. Karen let out a strangled noise, somewhere between a gasp and a choke. The total amount, the judge continued, will be $8,000. My lawyer nodded with satisfaction. I felt a rush of relief, but also something else, vindication. Justice had a way of settling into your bones, warm and calming. But the judge wasn't done. In addition, she said, I am ordering a formal inquiry into the homeowner association's conduct, documentation practices, and decision-making processes. If evidence of fraudulent or falsified records is found, further legal action will be taken. Now Karen fully collapsed into her chair. Her eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. This case, the judge finished, should serve as a reminder that authority, real authority, comes with responsibility and limits. No organization, no matter how confident in its policies, may extend its reach beyond lawful boundaries. She slammed her gavel down. Case closed. But not finished, not for Karen. As people began to file out of the courtroom, I stayed seated. I didn't want to gloat. I didn't want to parade my victory. I just wanted a moment to breathe. Karen didn't give me one. She approached heels, clicking sharply, shoulders tight. You ruined everything, she hissed under her breath, low enough that only I and my lawyer could hear. I met her gaze. You did that yourself. This isn't over, she whispered through clenched teeth. You've humiliated me. My lawyer stepped forward. Miss Harris, you may want to be careful. Anything you say now could become part of the inquiry. Her eyes flicked to him, full of venom. Then she spun on her heel and stormed out of the courtroom. Her board members didn't follow her. They stayed behind, thanking the judge, apologizing to me, trying to salvage whatever dignity they had left. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt different, brighter, lighter, almost celebratory. As I stepped down the stairs, neighbors patted my shoulder, shook my hand, told me they were glad someone finally stood up to her. But the real closure came later that evening. I was back home sitting on the front porch with Ranger at my feet when I saw a group of people walking up the driveway. At first I tensed, more HOA trouble, but as they got closer I recognized them. A few of the board members, the ones who'd confessed in court. They stopped at the porch steps. We came to apologize, one woman said. We should have checked. We shouldn't have trusted her blindly. I nodded. Thank you. The man beside her held up a folded paper. This is the official statement from the HOA, he said. We're removing Karen from the presidency effective immediately, and we're requesting county oversight. Another woman stepped forward. And we want to help rebuild your bridge. That caught me off guard. You don't have to, I said. We know, she replied softly. But we want to. And for the first time since the bridge was destroyed, something in me unclenched. Maybe not all of them were villains. Maybe some of them had just been misled. They left quietly, with humble goodbyes. I watched them walk away, then looked out toward the creek, still a mess of broken planks and muddy water, but now it felt less like a wound and more like a project waiting to be restored. Karen had set out to break something. Instead, she'd built something she never intended, a community that finally stood up to her. In the days following the court hearing, the atmosphere around the farm shifted in ways I didn't expect. Where tension and hostility had once seeped from the neighboring subdivision like runoff after a storm, now there was something steadier, quieter, almost apologetic. People waved instead of glaring. A few even slowed their cars to shout a polite hello when driving past my gate. Word had spread fast. Not just about the ruling, but about the inquiry, something that had the HOA board scrambling and the community buzzing with questions. People had begun whispering about where their dues were really going, what else Karen might have forged or reinterpreted, and how long she'd been bending rules behind the scenes. For once, all that scrutiny wasn't aimed at me. But I wasn't naive. I knew better than to think everything was suddenly solved. Justice might have landed its blow in court, but the ripple effects were still spreading, and some of those ripples were hitting Karen harder than I imagined. 2 days after the case closed, I saw her for the first time since our confrontation. I'd gone into town early to pick up lumber and supplies, my mind already turning to the task of rebuilding the bridge, when I caught a glimpse of someone familiar stepping out of the post office. Even before she turned, I recognized the posture. The way she clutched her binder like it was a shield. The tilt of her chin, that desperate attempt at poise that just didn't hold anymore. Karen. But she wasn't dressed in her usual perfection. Her blazer was wrinkled. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and her steps lacked the sharp confidence she once weaponized against half the county. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she spotted me. Her jaw tightened and she stiffened as if preparing for a collision that hadn't happened yet. She turned sharply and walked the other way, nearly tripping over the curb as she hurried to her car. I didn't follow. I didn't shout after her. I didn't feel the urge to rub in her defeat. Seeing her like that small, shaken strip of the inflated authority she clung to was victory enough. On my way back to the farm, I thought about something my dad used to say. Some people only understand boundaries when they run face first into them. Karen had hit hers at full speed. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed 3 pickup trucks along the fence line. For a split second, my muscles tensed, old instincts kicking in after weeks of harassment, but then I recognized the men standing near the creek. Hank, Tom from the hardware store, and Charlie, a retired engineer who lived 2 miles down the road. They waved when they saw me. "You didn't think we were going to let you rebuild this thing alone, did you?" Charlie called out. "Looks like we beat you to the planning stage," Hank added, patting a rolled-up blueprint. I blinked, stunned for a moment. "You're here to help, all of you, hell yes," Tom said with a chuckle. "Karen messed with the wrong farmer. If we can help put things right, we will." I felt a warmth in my chest that hadn't been there in weeks. Not anger, not relief. Something better, like a knot loosening after being pulled too tight for too long. We spent the next couple of hours going over ideas. The original bridge had been simple, functional, but the new one, these guys had visions. Charlie spread out his blueprint over the hood of Hank's truck. I was thinking reinforced beams, cedar planks, a slight arch, something sturdy enough to last another 100 years. "Maybe add some seating along the side," Hank said. "Make it a place to sit and look at the water. Could run some lighting too," Tom added. "Nothing fancy. Solar maybe." I listened as they talked, my heart unexpectedly full. This wasn't just about repairing damage anymore. They wanted to build something meaningful, something better, something that reclaimed what Karen tried to tear down. As we worked, the board members from the HOA started trickling by one. They didn't approach. They didn't interfere. They simply watched from their side of the property line, quiet and contemplative. Some looked ashamed, others looked relieved. A few waved hesitantly. It was a strange reversal from the way things had been only weeks before. By late afternoon, we had the foundation frame measured out, stakes placed, and the materials list finalized. The sun cast long shadows across the creek, turning the broken remains of the old bridge into silhouettes that felt less like scars and more like the early stages of rebuilding. As the men packed up to leave, Hank clapped me on the shoulder. "She might have knocked it down," he said, "but look how many folks are standing with you now. That's something she can never take." He was right. Karen's destruction had accidentally built connections I didn't even realize were possible. That night after dinner, I walked down to the creek alone. The grass was cool beneath my boots, and the air held that crisp edge that comes just before fall truly settles in. The moon cast a silver glow across the water, reflecting off the shattered planks still scattered along the bank. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the rush of the creek. Then I knelt and began picking up the pieces, one by one. Some of the boards were too splintered to salvage, but a few were still intact, weathered, worn, but solid. I stacked them carefully on the bank. Something told me they deserved a second life, maybe as a bench, maybe as part of the railing, maybe something else. But they weren't going to rot where they fell. They mattered, just like the memories tied to them. As I worked, a soft crunch of gravel behind me caught my attention. I turned, and there, standing with her arms folded and posture stiff as iron, was one of the HOA board members. Not Karen. A different woman, tall, composed, with graying hair tucked behind her ears. "Evening," she said quietly. "Evening." She stepped closer but stayed on her side of the boundary line. I wanted to say, "Thank you." I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For handling everything the way you did," she replied. "Karen, she made us believe things that weren't true. A lot of us trusted her blindly. That won't happen again." I studied her expression. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't offering excuses. It was remorse and resolve. "I appreciate that," I said after a moment. "Truly." She nodded once. "We'll be cooperating fully with the inquiry, and whatever the court needs, we'll provide. But personally," she hesitated, "I hope someday you can forgive us." I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness wasn't something you rushed. But the fact that she'd come at all that mattered. Maybe I said finally. In time, she smiled a small, tired smile, then turned to walk back toward her neighborhood. As she left, I looked again at the scattered wood, the flowing water, the half-built future waiting to take shape. For the first time since the bridge came down, I felt whole again. The next week we broke ground, real ground, not the figurative kind. Trucks rolled in, tools clattered. Men laughed and argued and hammered and measured. The rhythm of rebuilding filled the air. But the biggest surprise came 3 days into construction. A black SUV pulled up near the property line. The door opened, and Karen stepped out. My breath caught without my permission. She didn't walk toward me. She didn't yell. She didn't carry any folders or threats or printed letters. She just stood there, hands clasped tightly, staring at the new beams rising where the old bridge once stood. Then she turned and walked away without a word. It struck me then that she wasn't coming to fight. She was coming to say goodbye in the only way someone like her knew how. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The morning after Karen's silent visit, the farm felt different, not lighter exactly, but calmer, like the air itself had finally stopped bracing for confrontation. The sun rose over the pasture, casting warm gold across the half-finished structure spanning the creek. The new bridge stood proud even in its skeleton form, thick cedar beams, precisely measured supports, a frame that promised strength and permanence. Ranger trotted ahead of me as I walked down the slope, tail wagging lazily. He sniffed the lumber, circled the worksite, then flopped down in the grass with a satisfied grunt. Animals always knew when the danger had passed before the people did. By mid-morning, the crew, mostly neighbors and a few friends, showed up ready to work. Hank carried a thermos of coffee big enough to supply a small army. Tom brought a box of screws he'd liberated from the hardware store's overstock pile. Charlie had a level tucked under his arm, like a general carrying a sword. "Ready to make history?" Charlie asked. "Let's make it sturdier than any HOA complaint," I said. The laughter that followed was genuine, full-bodied, unforced, the kind that comes from people who've weathered the same storm and made it through together. We fell into an easy rhythm, measuring, sawing, drilling, leveling. The smell of fresh-cut cedar mixed with the earthy scent of the creek. Birds chattered overhead. The clack of hammers echoed through the trees like a heartbeat. Around noon we broke for a quick lunch, sandwiches Hank's wife had sent along, lemonade Tom's daughter had made. As we ate, the conversation drifted back to the HOA investigation. The county had officially opened an inquiry, and they'd already requested financial records from the past 5 years. I heard from my cousin Hank said between bites that Karen was funneling HOA dues into her personal beautification projects. Meaning what I asked. Meaning she bought a bunch of fancy landscaping plants and a custom mailbox imported from Italy. Tom snorted. Imagine losing your mind over a wooden bridge while ordering a $900 mailbox with vines carved into it. Seems fitting, I said. She always did care more about appearances than reality. Charlie shook his head. And now the board is left to clean up the mess she made. I didn't say it aloud, but part of me did pity them just a little. Not enough to forget what had happened, but enough to recognize they were people caught in the gravitational pull of someone else's ego. When you orbit someone like Karen long enough, it gets easy to mistake her narcissism for leadership. After lunch, we got back to work. With each board secured and each bolt tightened, the new bridge began to take shape, not just as a replacement, but as an improvement, a symbol of resilience, community, and reclaiming what had been taken. Late in the afternoon, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the water, a small group approached from the subdivision. At first, I stiffened, wondering if this was the start of another confrontation, but as they drew closer, their expressions told a different story. It was several members of the HOA board, the same ones who'd spoken up in court. The woman with graying hair, the man who'd admitted to trusting Karen blindly, and another board member I recognized from the earlier meeting. They walked slowly, respectfully, stopping at the edge of my property. "Mind if we come closer?" the woman asked. I nodded. "Come on." They approached carefully, taking in the construction with visible emotion. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "It will be," Charlie replied. "Give us another 2 days." The man stepped forward. "We came to tell you, the county's already uncovered discrepancies. Big ones. Karen was misusing funds. Not just a little, a lot." I exchanged looks with Hank and Tom. "What happens now?" I asked. "We're cooperating fully," the woman said. "We've called an emergency meeting to rewrite the bylaws, install oversight, and make sure nothing like this ever happens again." She swallowed, voice trembling slightly. "And we wanted to thank you for standing up, for pushing back. If you hadn't brought this to light, we might have kept trusting her, and things could have gotten worse." I nodded. "I don't hold the board responsible for what she did. She lied to all of us." Her eyes softened. That means a lot. They lingered for a moment longer, watching as we lined up the final beams of the day. Then before leaving, the woman extended her hand. Next time, she said, if anything feels off, come to us. We're trying to rebuild trust, literally and figuratively. I shook her hand. Fair enough. After they left, the evening settled in. The workers packed up, promising to return early the next morning. The sky turned deep orange, then dusky purple. The creek glittered under the fading light, carrying with it the last remnants of the shattered past. When it was quiet again, I stood on the near-complete bridge, breathing in the humid scent of cedar and flowing water. The structure felt strong beneath my boots, solid, dependable, born out of destruction but built on community. I thought back to the day Karen had stood smugly on this bank, arms crossed, believing she had the power to erase what she didn't like. She'd believed authority meant domination. That control equaled ownership. That fear was the same as respect. She'd been wrong. Authority means responsibility. Control means stewardship. Respect must be earned. And fear. Fear destroys everything it touches, including the one who wields it. The next day, we finished the bridge. Neighbors gathered on both sides of the creek. Kids ran up and down the new planks, squealing at the echo of their footsteps. Someone brought a camera. Someone else brought hot dogs and a grill. It was the kind of spontaneous celebration small towns excel at, joyful, sincere, effortless. The woman from the HOA brought over a plant, a peace offering, she said, with a sheepish smile. It was a sturdy little fern. I planted it near the base of the bridge. May this one, I joked, not require HOA approval. She laughed genuinely. As dusk settled, the solar lights along the railing flickered on soft, warm glows, reflecting off the creek. It was beautiful. Not grand, not expensive, not polished to perfection, just right. Later, after everyone had left, I sat on one of the benches we'd built from the salvaged wood of the old bridge. It felt symbolic, past woven into present scars, transformed into strength. Ranger curled at my feet. Fireflies blinked in the grass. The night hummed with quiet satisfaction. I thought of my father, of the day we built the first bridge, of the stories he told and the lessons he tried to leave behind. Then I thought of Karen, her arrogance, her downfall, her silent retreat. I didn't hate her. That surprised me. I didn't even wish her worse than what she'd already brought upon herself. Her loss wasn't my victory. My victory was the bridge, my community, my peace, my land restored. Before heading back to the house, I walked the length of the bridge one last time, feeling the wood beneath my boots, listening to the steady murmur of the creek below. For the first time since the confrontation began, everything felt whole again, balanced, unshaken. And I realized something important. Sometimes a battle hurts more than the damage itself, but the rebuilding done right can heal more than the battle ever broke. If this story hit you the way it hit me, let me know in the comments. Tell me what you would have done if an HOA tried to pull something like this on your land. And if you faced anything similar, share it. Your story might help someone else stand up for themselves. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next HOA meltdown, courtroom twist, or satisfying revenge. There are plenty more stories coming, and trust me, you'll want to see how they end.